All right, so we're recording. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to talk about COVID-19 and the volunteerism survey results that were done in California. I'm happy to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Tamekia Wilkins. Wilkins is the evaluation coordinator of the University of California Master Gardener Program. And Marisa Coyne is the volunteer engagement coordinator, also with California. So they had noticed some trends with volunteering in California. They decided to survey their volunteers. They will also join us next month. So I hope that you can sign back on to the webinars on April 21st and hear part 2 of this presentation. So today they'll talk about the background and sort of the impetus for surveying their volunteers and the results of that survey. And then next month, we will discuss a project Rubric that they developed to prioritize programs based on the initiatives in California and also working within the COVID-19 context. So with that, Tamekia and Marisa, you're welcome to start the presentation.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marisa Coyne, and I'm the academic coordinator for volunteer engagement with the University of California, or UC Master Gardener Program. My colleague, Tamekia Wilkins, is the evaluation coordinator for the UC Master Gardener Program, as Nicole mentioned. And together we developed and distributed a survey to our over 6,000 UC Master Gardener volunteers in the summer of 2020 to try to better understand how COVID-19 might impact their volunteer commitment for the coming program years. Today, you'll hear a bit about what motivated this survey project, the goals we hope to achieve, some select statewide results, and some possible applications of the findings. I want to thank the UC staff and volunteers throughout California who helped build this survey and the related tools. I see some folks, Louise, Judy, Aaliyah on this call, and who promoted the survey to volunteers. I also want to thank Nicole and the Extension Master Gardener Community and National Committee for giving us this opportunity to present. The way that my screen is displaying right now, you probably see a black bar at the top and the bottom. That we had a little bit of challenge with screen sharing. So I hope this is working well for you. If you need a copy of the slide deck, Nicole distributed that through the EMG listserv earlier today. So there's a PDF version that should be in your inbox as well. And Tamekia, I'll share my screen and you'll let me know when it's time for me to advance your slides, okay? Okay, so the background and goals of this survey. In early 2020, as COVID-19, as the pandemic was beginning in the United States, nonprofit and volunteer engagement organizations were predicting a 50% decrease in volunteer commitment for the duration of the pandemic, which is still ongoing, as we all understand, and for some time thereafter. So we probably won't likely see an immediate recovery in our volunteer commitment, even as some of the statewide or national restrictions begin to lift or as folks become vaccinated. So this is going to have a significant impact on our volunteer commitment moving forward. The surveys that Volunteer Match distributed indicated that volunteer managers should expect to adapt their programs and adjust their volunteer engagement and utilization strategies accordingly. So in California, we decided to distribute our own survey to better understand the specific aspects of our program that may be impacted or the specific impacts. We think that Master Gardener programs are a little bit different for a couple of reasons. One reason that I'll share is we have a membership model that's really robust. This isn't necessarily a short-term volunteer organization. It's really a relationship between the organization and the volunteer. So it's different from some other kind of one-time or short-term volunteer opportunities for folks. Also, the topic that we educate on is never been more relevant. It's never been more relevant. Around the country and around the world, COVID-19 has impacted every facet of life, and we've all been impacted differently depending upon our unique characteristics or the different contexts that we live and move in. However, in every context, interest in home horticulture and in gardening and in participating in community food systems has increased dramatically. And in California, that's meant a couple of different things. It's meant that at the statewide level, we're seeing a huge increase in the submissions of our Become a UC Master Gardener referral form. So over the same period in 2019, we had an increase of almost 50%, of 45% of people who were over the previous year who were saying, I'd like to become a UC Master Gardener. I want to learn more about garden education and volunteering and supporting my community. Also, our our county level coordinators, and we have folks from the Sacramento area and from Southern California and the Central Valley on the call today, and they can attest that counties throughout California, and I'm sure throughout the US, are reporting dramatic increases in engagement with their digital resources, including their live presentations, their social media, and their traditional help desk services, which now have moved online or to email or using all kinds of creative strategies. So we're different from other volunteer organizations in some ways in the sense that we have a long-term relationship with our volunteers. We tend to see volunteers who volunteer for 8 years. In California, that's the average. And also we're delivering content that is incredibly relevant at this particular moment. So that's why Tamekia and I wanted to distribute this survey, and that's what we did. So Volunteer Match is the organization that kind of tipped us off to thinking about volunteer commitment impacts in COVID-19. And so when we learned that we were expecting to see a decrease, we wanted to distribute our own survey, as I mentioned, but we wanted this survey to kind of be a survey that we could compare to the national level results. So we did use the same questions that Volunteer Match used. However, we did post the questions to our internal message board for UC Master Gardener Program coordinators and lead volunteers so that they could review the questions and comment on them. And we made some subtle changes, but we still wanted to retain the integrity of the original tool so that we could compare our data with the national data that Volunteer Match was finding. So the goals of this project were threefold: to provide cooperative extension personnel with data about projected volunteer commitment for the 2020-2021 program year, and we do a June to July program year, and the 2021 to 2022 program year. So we have these two program years as our target, what we expect to be our most impacted years. But we don't really know what the future holds with regard to global pandemic. So it's potential that these survey results or these findings could impact our decisions beyond these two program years. We also wanted to provide cooperative extension personnel with data about projected volunteer fears, needs, concerns, so that they could appropriately address them. We see that as important to volunteer engagement and volunteer safety. Our volunteers have a right to safety when they participate with our organization. We also wanted to support cooperative extension personnel as they're strategically planning to deliver UC Master Gardener Program mission-related activities in the new normal. So we'll talk about that a little bit later when we come to project prioritization, but at this particular moment, we are going to have fewer resources. Our volunteers are resources. We're also potentially looking, I'm sure folks have experienced this across the nation, at tightening budgets for cooperative extension. So when we have diminished resources, what does that mean? We can't expect ourselves to do the same number of activities potentially, but we can still have high impact if we're being really strategic about how we use those limited resources for the next couple of years. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tamekia Wilkins to talk about the statewide results, and then I'll come back to you all about how we're thinking about applying these results and some next steps. So Tamekia, just let me know when you want me to advance.
All right, sounds good, Marisa. And again, thank you all for being here. I'm happy to be presenting these results with you. So basically, Marisa has given you all the goals and the purpose of us doing the survey. And as she said, I'm going to focus on the results from the survey that we did in Qualtrics. So today I'm going to focus on the statewide results. I should note that we did distribute individual county Master Gardener Program results so that the counties will be able to strategically plan for these upcoming program years. Next slide, Marisa. All right, so here's some information about our sample and timeline for distributing results to the counties. We had a 54% participation rate based on the number of surveys that were sent out. So as you can see, we sent out over 6,000 surveys to volunteers throughout California in the Master Gardener Program. The survey was online to participate. So Master Gardeners must have an email address on file with the program. Master Gardeners in all but 4 of the counties with programs participated. So overall, we had county participation in all programs with the exception of 4. So prior to sending out the survey to volunteers, we were sure to socialize the survey to county coordinators via a brown bag, so they would be in the loop and able to provide feedback. and have their questions answered regarding the survey, because they're the first line of contact for volunteers. So it's very important that they knew what was going on and that they can have their questions answered, so that when their volunteers ask them questions, they will be able to confidently address those questions and concerns from volunteers. The survey was sent out in July, and participants were given 3 weeks to participate. 2 reminder emails were sent out periodically. So participants who had not yet participated would get the email. So everybody didn't get the email again. Only those who had not yet started the survey got the reminder emails. Once the survey closed, statewide results were analyzed and a report with findings was developed. This report was sent to counties in September, along with their individual county data, because oftentimes counties are interested in knowing, what their results look like compared to the statewide results. For smaller counties, data from other similar counties were included in their report. So this was done at the request of county coordinators. Providing the county report and the statewide report again allowed counties to see how they responded to the survey and how the state as a whole responded. Next slide, Marisa. So here are just a few of the survey questions on the screen here. As you can see, these items align with the goals of the survey mentioned earlier. Also note that we are intentional with some of the items, asking for their responses based on their volunteer role with the UC Master Gardener program. This was important because it's possible that participants held other volunteer roles with other organizations, whether they were organizations within UC A&R, or they're just other organizations that they volunteer with outside of cooperative extension. And so we wanted to make sure they responded as it related to their participation with our program, our Master Gardener program. So just some of the questions, for example, they were asked, how concerned are you about the impact of current conditions, environmental, economic, social, on the UC Master Gardener program? And then they were able to respond to that. So here, feel free to take a screenshot if you would like. We'll give a couple of seconds for that. And if you're interested in the full survey, you can feel free to reach out to us and we can send you a PDF version of all of the items that we asked in the survey. All right, and so this is what just a screenshot, a couple of screenshots, well, one here and one on the next slide, of what the survey looked like in Qualtrics. And again, when we're thinking about the Qualtrics survey, the good thing about it being online and electronic is that participants can take it on any type of device. So they can use a computer, but they can also use a cell phone to respond to the questions. Next slide. All of the items in this survey were multiple choice, but some did allow more than one item to be selected. So depending on the question, participants may have been able to select all of the items or all of the response choices that applied to them in their volunteer role with the Master Gardener program. Next slide. So now let's get into the actual findings. So here are some of the results from the survey. As you can see from the graphs on this slide, a larger percentage of participants, so 52%, indicated they were concerned about the impact of current conditions on their individual program activities than on the program as a whole, which was 43% of people reported being concerned. As a whole, we found that there was some level of concern for individual activities and for the program as a whole, with only a few participants indicating no concern for each survey item. So overall, given the current conditions, volunteers did report being concerned in some way. Next slide. Participants were also asked about their intentions to volunteer during the program year, assuming the current conditions remain. So for this item, participants could mark all responses that applied to them. Findings indicated that more than 40% of participants were interested in helping in person and helping virtually. Because participants could mark more than one response for this survey item, we did some further analysis to see which participants indicated that they wanted to help in person and also help virtually. And so that indicated that 22% of participants marked both response options. We should also note that more than 1/3 of participants indicated they were uncertain of their intentions of volunteering. So they're not sure what that's going to look like for them. Next slide. Participants were also responded to which in-person activities they would feel comfortable participating in if allowed by their county and the UCANR. So participants can mark all response options that apply to them again. The results showed that the activities indicated participants were more likely to express being comfortable participating in activities that take place outside. For example, 57% of participants indicated they would be comfortable participating or maintaining demonstration gardens. 56% of participants indicated they'd be comfortable participating in outdoor UC Master Gardener training. You can see that only 14% of participants indicated they would be comfortable participating in indoor UC Master Gardener training. So you can kind of start to see that difference. So you've got more people, again, willing to participate in UC Master Gardener training outside, and a much less percentage willing to participate in training inside. A fewer percentage of participants were also likely to report feeling comfortable participating in other indoor activities. These findings, they likely coincide with information from public health sources that we should limit our time indoors, and people who with people who don't live in the same home as you do. Next slide. When asking volunteers about barriers that might affect their volunteer commitment, we found that most participants indicated barriers such as regulations around large gatherings could affect their volunteer commitment. We also found that almost 2/3 of volunteers reported that fear of being exposed to illness was a barrier. 40% of volunteers indicated that fear of exposing others to the illness was a barrier. So as you can see, what we see in the news and what we see here from our public health organizations, it coincides to their volunteer commitment or how they see themselves volunteering in the program. Next slide. Here are some other barriers that were included as response options. Again, participants could select all that apply. As you can see, things like financial concerns and time constraints and fear of social stigma were not seen as a barrier for most volunteers, with only 5% of volunteers reporting financial concerns might affect their volunteer commitment. So again, it was those overarching things like regulations and things like fear of being exposed to the illness or exposing others. Those had a higher percentage of people reporting as barriers. Next slide. And I think I just saw a question pop up, and we will get to questions when we complete the presentation. So we'll go back to the question that was just seen in the chat. So when asked whether volunteers had attended happenings online during COVID, more than 1/3 of participants indicated they had attended general meetings, project committee meetings, or live continuing ed events online. Almost 27% of volunteers had listened to recorded continuing ed events. Here we see that a large majority of participants had not attended online happenings, but of all the response options, more volunteers had participated in these happenings. Next slide. Fewer participants had attended items in the areas that are included on this slide, so including trainings and public education events. The items on this slide are interesting because they really focus on volunteer development, and fewer people have participated in them. So we sent out county level reports again. So this is something we encourage them to think about, how to get volunteers more involved online, or how to provide these types of opportunities to volunteers. Because it's also important for us to note that our volunteers are at different levels, and they're people as well, and they may also not have the training or the confidence to use some of the online materials. So it could be different things, either fewer events or happenings are being offered in the counties, or the volunteers may be less comfortable using online tools. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Marisa.
Thank you so much, Tamekia, for sharing those statewide findings. So Tamekia has given us a lot to think about. There are a number of different directions that we could kind of take this conclusions and potential applications conversation. There are a few things that popped out to me this time that I hadn't quite noticed before. For example, I think that difference between concern about fear of being exposed to illness and concern about exposing others is really interesting. So when you're thinking about messaging to your volunteers, maybe really thinking about the messaging that might be most impactful is addressing what's going to help volunteers feel safe themselves and prevent them from being exposed to illness. I'm also really curious about the difference between folks who say they're interested in volunteering online, which was something around 41%, and folks who have actually attended online offerings, which was somewhere around like 36% or something like that. So there were some folks in there who are definitely gettable, but haven't been able to attend, perhaps for some of the other reasons that we pointed out in the survey, or that folks are identifying in the chat, like that reticence to adopt new technologies or concern about utilizing new technologies. So I'm going to share a couple of other takeaways here, and then we hope to wrap up this presentation portion in the next couple of minutes here, and then hear some questions from the group, or maybe some suggestions about how you all are interpreting these findings, or what you're doing to anticipate impacts to your volunteer commitment in your counties or in your state. And one thing I do want to lead with before I go into the conclusions and potential applications, if you're currently in a space where you're finding that you're only really having touch with a third of your volunteers, or somewhere around 40% of your volunteers, that's normal. That's borne out by what we saw in the national data from Volunteer Match, and in California, where we nearly quadrupled the N of the survey that was done by Volunteer Match. So we're really seeing some significant impacts. With that, I'll share a couple of key recommendations and takeaways that I've been thinking about. Volunteers are viewing their own projects and activities as more vulnerable than the program itself. So think back to that first slide where we asked, how concerned are you about the current conditions impacting the UC Master Gardener program, or slot in your own Master Gardener program, the program itself, or your individual projects and activities. So volunteers identify very, very strongly with the activities and projects that they have participated in, perhaps even more strongly than they do with the organization itself. So think about that. If you're thinking about limiting your project load, like right now, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're dealing with impacts to resources, human resources in our volunteers, as well as financial resources, as budgets are being squeezed all over the nation in the wake of COVID-19. So there are impacts to those resources. You may have to carry a smaller project load, or be really deliberate and strategic about what you're going to invest those resources in. However, volunteers are strongly identifying with their projects and activities, and they may be worried that their project or activity is the one that's going to get the boot. So think about using tentative language, talk about sunsetting or pausing projects rather than canceling them, or we're not going to do that. Be maybe thoughtful and gentle in that language. However, there is, of course, a place for saying, you know what, this project no longer meets our program mission or aligns with our strategic initiatives or responds to local needs. And those may be conversations that you want to have more directly. But if you're thinking about change management in your organization and bringing along those folks who really do feel committed to the mission, but may have a strong identification with one project or activity, some tentative language could be useful. Next, I would recommend, and we would recommend, identifying your virtual and in-person switch hitters. So 22% of respondents to this survey said that they wanted to volunteer online and they wanted to volunteer in person. That means that these volunteers are going to have touch with the other volunteers that want to volunteer online and want to volunteer in person. So messaging to those individuals has the potential to be really impactful. You can reach the other 40% of volunteers that just want to volunteer online or just want to volunteer in person, or perhaps it's more than that. But those are your people who are going to be your super volunteers in this time, those people who can pivot neatly between kind of in-person and online activities. So identify who those folks are. They're going to be really good messengers for any administrative or programmatic changes, and think about building that kind of switch hitter, virtual in-person volunteer core. Finally, volunteers are anxious to get back together and back in the garden. When we look at what motivates Master Gardener volunteers, we always talk about our volunteers are learning motivated. Our volunteers want to acquire knowledge and information, but that's not the only significant motivation. The longer that folks spend in our program, the more their motivation becomes social affiliation. These are their community members, their fellow volunteers. And so I definitely recommend, while there may be some sense of urgency, you know, gardening is so important right now. There are lots of demands, a desire to really show community impact. It's okay to take some time, especially in these early stages, perhaps. We're starting to allow ourselves to envision a future in which we're able to be together outside in a social distanced manner. Of course, you need to follow your own state's guidelines and your local guidelines, but it is an important volunteer engagement activity to steward that volunteer community. And we definitely need to, as an Extension Master Gardener program nationwide, for sure improve our outreach and improve our cultural competency of volunteers. And there's a lot that we need to do urgently, but it's also okay to take some time to steward that volunteer community and have that in-person gathering when it's safe, or outdoor gathering when it's safe, be really focused on loving on your volunteers and providing them with an opportunity to be together, and being flexible with that. So those are 3 recommendations that we wanted to share with you all. We also see some really unique opportunities in this moment. COVID-19 has been really challenging and sad and difficult in so many different ways, and all of us have our own personal stories about those impacts. You know, some more grave than others. But there is an opportunity in this moment to come back as a program that is more focused and more mission driven and more representative of those who are interested in gardening or interested in sharing knowledge and information about gardening. So I do want to focus for a moment on the opportunities in this moment. As you perhaps pare down your project load, either including volunteers in that process or not, you have an opportunity to focus on projects that align with cooperative extension and land grant missions, with your university strategic initiatives, with your unique county areas of brilliance that really showcase your volunteers' skills. And as Missy said, all gardeners know that to create a garden with a big wow factor, there are times when you need to edit that garden through pruning or plant removal. And we have an opportunity to edit and to do this in a way that's cooperative and supportive of one another. And also this data that we have in California and that, you know, perhaps you'd like to collect in your own states. I think some folks have already started doing some of that work as well. You can make a data-driven decision. Hey, we're going to have an impact to our volunteer commitment. We're going to have an impact to our resources. There's an organizational need to pare down our project load or to change our priorities or be really focused on a few specific goals for the next couple of years. And ultimately, we want to focus on those projects that meet the educational mission and address the needs of our communities and priorities of our communities. And we want to elevate those efforts and projects. This doesn't need to be a situation in which we're inventing a bunch of new projects, but we can really look critically and carefully at those projects that we do currently have and think about how to tweak them or improve them, in particular to enhance our county programs, our statewide programs' ability to serve the needs and interests of clientele not traditionally engaged or served by cooperative extension programs. This is a really exciting time, not to just return to the status quo, but to return with a renewed commitment to the mission. And it's challenging. It's challenging to let go of projects, but in gathering this data, we want to honor our current capacity and really do a little bit less with less, but also keep that impact really high because we know that's so important to the sustainability of our programs, and it's important to what we are as an extension program, which is about extending knowledge and information. And then finally, the opportunity here is to improve volunteer commitment actually through redress of volunteer needs. So we asked volunteers what they were concerned about. And if we can specifically address that in our messaging, we can let volunteers know we care about your safety. We don't just care about the impact that you provide in the community. That's really meaningful and important, but we really care about you and your health and safety. And if you tell us that you're only going to be comfortable with being outside, okay. If you tell us that you're struggling with technology, okay, we are going to need to move in the direction of doing some program delivery online where that's possible. Not every place is the same, but that's the direction that we do need to be pushing in and going in. But we can improve that volunteer commitment through addressing their needs in our messaging. I want to give a quick preview of next week's presentation. So this is a project prioritization rubric that was developed in tandem with a county director, wonderful county director in Inyo in California, and a wonderful coordinator in Santa Barbara, California. And if you'd like to learn more about this project that we put together, or work with any of the materials that we developed, I hope you'll join us next month, where we talk about utilizing this project prioritization rubric to help make those decisions about how to strengthen projects, or which projects folks might want to sunset for a time when there are more volunteer and financial resources available. Before I conclude, I want to say that we have seen a tremendous amount, while we're talking about impacts to volunteer commitment, there have been impacts. And in our 2019-2020 year, we were able to maintain our volunteer commitment at 6,000, a little over 6,000 in California, but we did see a decrease in our contacts with the public, which we expected. And we did see a decrease in the number of events. And we saw an increase in volunteers who were saying, I want to remain with the program, but I was unable to complete my volunteer hours this year. So we know that we're going to expect to see perhaps a little bit more of that this year, because this has been an entire year in the COVID-19 era, rather than just that few months when we were getting our feet underneath of us. But at the same time, when we might be expecting to see fewer contacts, I'm curious to see what happens, because I've also witnessed like a tremendous amount of innovation and creativity on the part of coordinators and volunteers in California. And I'm sure you all have stories like this from the states and counties that you're in Southern California, in San Bernardino and Orange counties. Folks there have nearly doubled the size of their trainee class, because they were previously limited by the seats in the classroom and the space that they used to train volunteers, to train new UC Master Gardeners. And this year they said, we want to offer a training online, and they were able to double that number of volunteers. And while some evidence suggests that virtual volunteers, their training level is exactly as good as folks that experience the training in person, sometimes there's an impact to retention, but we all know that retention isn't the only way to measure volunteer success. So we're really, really excited that now we're going to have twice as many new garden educators in Southern California to support communities that are interested in growing food, or working on fire-wise landscapes or water-wise installations, those kinds of things. And in Contra Costa County and Alameda in the Bay Area of California, so San Francisco Bay, there's been amazing creativity. There was a transition of a tomato plant sale into a tomato plant giveaway, which resulted in contacts with hundreds of community members in the Bay Area that hadn't had contact with the UC Master Gardener program before, because those tomato plants were given away when families and students were picking up free and reduced lunches in public schools in the Bay Area. So there is a lot of creativity. So I'm really curious to see what happens in the next couple of years. And while we're talking about impact, or an impact to our volunteer commitment and resources, we're also seeing a huge impact in our community at the same time. So it is possible. It is possible to do both with a lot of love and labor from coordinators and volunteers alike. It's been pretty amazing. So with that, I'm going to conclude our presentation. Tamekia and I will drop our email addresses in the chat if there's something that you want to follow up with, and we're happy to take questions. Nicole, I haven't been monitoring the chat closely, so if there's something that popped up that you think Tamekia and I should address, please let me know.
Actually, Marisa, I'm gonna, since Nicole has background noise, I'm gonna go through the chat and I'll kind of read the questions and we can address them. So earlier on, I think we may have kind of answered it a little bit in our discussion. Nicole asked, do you think a barrier might be use of technology, digital literacy skills? And so I would say, yes, Nicole, that could be a potential barrier. We didn't include that in our response options for barriers, but we did include other. And I can recall exactly what all the other items were, but there were about almost 10%, I think, that responded other. So that may have been some of the responses that they included in there. And then based on what people have seen thus far, just in amongst their volunteers or in their volunteer groups, a lot of people do have issues using technology and aren't as comfortable with it, since that's not how it's been in the past either.
Yeah, Tamekia, thanks. I think that's a good point. We did have that other category, which was less than 10%. So still, even if folks were thinking about connectivity or comfortability or confidence with technology, they would have put that into the other category, and we only saw 10%. So it still wasn't, it's significant, but it still wasn't one of the top three barriers that folks identified. But feel free to share in the chat if folks have other data from other counties and states, please do feel free to share that with us in the chat. I do see a comment from Leanne, and I don't know if you want to expand on that, Leanne, but I do think that there's an exciting opportunity now that trainings in some counties are being offered online. That means that those volunteers are going to have greater fluency with technology, and we are going to need to continue to do our program delivery online to really reach our extension mission if we're going to continue to have periods of time where we can only do extension delivery online. So it's exciting to think that those volunteers not only are trained UC Master Gardeners or Master Gardeners, but they also have a level of tech fluency that's going to help them be really effective extenders of information. And I think it's sort of we weren't asking questions about technology specifically in this survey. We were trying to understand kind of what might impact in the post-pandemic era, what we might see after. But certainly technology is playing a role in both increasing our opportunities and creating some challenges for some of our volunteers, perhaps that are in places with poor connectivity or who don't feel confident or competent online, or who simply don't want to participate online. Because we do have some folks where it's not necessarily an issue of competence or confidence, it's a preference for in-person activity.
All right, and then Lynn asked, did you experience or address rogue, some Master Gardener volunteers that did their in-person projects anyway and did not tell anyone?
That wasn't, thanks for that question. We did not ask that question in our survey, but I'm sure that some of the county folks on the call might have experiences or anecdotes that they could share. We were assuming participation in university sanctioned activities and not necessarily asking. I wonder if those volunteers would candidly report if they had continued to conduct in-person activities, but we did not gather any information about that in this survey tool. But I'm sure that folks on the call have tales of rogue volunteers. And it's interesting, I was just in a conversation with my counterpart, the academic coordinator for volunteer engagement in the UC Master or the UC 4-H Youth Development Program yesterday, and we are anticipating an increase in some volunteer conflicts as folks come back into an in-person or hybrid model, because I'm sure that there are volunteers throughout the state in both the 4-H Youth Development Program and the UC Master Gardener Program who have decided to empower themselves to make decisions on behalf of the program. And so that is something we're preparing for, although I haven't personally spoken with any coordinators or volunteers who are dealing with that currently. But I feel for you, and I do think that we're going to see a little bit of an uptick in that volunteer conflict resolution, because that's a challenge. That's a failure to defer to the authority of the University of California staff and academics, or whatever university you're representing. So I'm sorry you're dealing with that, and in a way, I think we are all going to be dealing with that to some degree in the next couple of years here. So I hope that helps, but feel free to populate the chat, folks, if you have other stories or suggestions.
Yeah, Marisa, and I agree. And with a lot of states starting their reopening plans or reopening processes and things like that, that may have something to do with it potentially if people feel like they're, the public health may say this or this may be reopened, so they may just automatically assume everything is just back to normal. So that's going to be really important to encourage volunteers to remember to look for those, in our case, the UC A&R guidelines and see what they're saying versus, well, everything is open, we can do it now. So yeah. All right, Lynn also asked, with the average older age in most Master Gardener volunteer programs, do you have a feeling for the attrition rate, those standing back forever, perhaps ahead of the time they normally would have retired? So I guess this question is basically saying some people may have waited to retire, but do you think some people are retiring from volunteering at this moment sooner than they would have normally?
That's a good question, Lynn. I think I think I'll have to get back to you in August. So we do our annual reappointment process in June and July of every year. Now, last year when we did our reappointment process, we had a few months that were COVID-19 impacted in California from March to June. And so we maintained our volunteer commitment at that, in terms of number of volunteers, at just over 6,000. That's normal for us. Sometimes we see a fluctuation, 100 volunteers this way, 100 volunteers that way. We did see some counties that saw some decreases. We saw some counties that saw some increases. So I think this year is going to be very telling. We'll find out if more volunteers are selecting not to reappoint with our program. We do have an option for volunteers called limited active. I'm not sure if that kind of status exists in other counties or in other states. But that option allows for kind of extenuating circumstances. If volunteers are saying, I for whatever reason, and they don't have to disclose, they self-identify that this is an extenuating circumstance and they're going to be unable to commit to their volunteer service for 13 months, they can go on limited active. And that allows us to support volunteers if they're in a grieving process, if they're supporting a family member, if they themselves are sick. That option is there for volunteers to kind of put their commitment on pause for a year, but still they're covered by UC insurance. They're still connected in our volunteer management system. They still have access to the UC tools and resources, but they're free of that kind of burden of reporting their hours, et cetera, and they don't have a commitment that's hanging over their head. So that's been an accessibility piece that we've always offered for many, many years, as long as I've been a part of the program, to volunteers. So we did see more volunteers selecting that in 2019, 2020. It will be very interesting to see what happens when the numbers start rolling in the fall of this year. If we can see, is there an increase in those folks who are saying, I need to go on limited active. I'm not going to be able to manage my family and my grandkids and my and some of the health challenges that I'm having. I need to be on limited active for this year. Or the number who are saying, I really need to choose not to reappoint. So we saw all of the same number of folks reappointed in our previous year, but many of them said, I didn't complete my hours. I was really waiting on those springtime opportunities to complete my hours. And so I'll get them next year, or I'll have to talk to my coordinator about what's going to be feasible. Or, you know, it's simply not going to be possible for this year, but I'm going to give it a full go in the following year. So it'll be interesting to see. I'll have to get back to you in the fall.
And so it looks like those are all of the questions, but then we do have some comments where people, you know, based on what Marisa has been saying, people are in agreement, or they're having their own, you know, similar experiences with different issues, such as technology use, as well as with, you know, retirement, you know, of volunteers. So I think at this time, if you all want to continue posting questions in chat, or you can also take yourself off mute and ask a question, feel free to do that as well.
I want to share, thanks Tamekia, I want to share Nicole. Nicole again is having some background noise, so I want to give voice to her comment because I think it's really important. A few comments and observations from Nicole. I believe the social affiliation you mentioned is important to volunteers. I was concerned that we would have less volunteers recertifying due to COVID-19, but in my county, we had really good turnout for recertification. Intention is there, but getting those folks engaged with remote volunteering is the challenge. I appreciate you mentioning safety concerns of EMGs. My office is not open fully, but as we bring volunteers back, I plan to include our safety procedures and COVID-19 protocols, yes, when we share opportunities for EMGs to come back into the office. So proactively addressing that potential barrier, that's going to increase a feeling of safety, and it's also going to transmit a message of we're concerned for you as an individual, and your safety is important to us in this organization. Great point about virtual and in-person switch hitters. They make great recruits for committees that can assist other EMGs and coordinators with various online and in-person roles. For example, I have a team of techie EMGs helping with our transition to a new volunteer management system, and they earn hours. Okay, that is great. So thinking about, I'm sure some coordinators on this call are like, okay, I need to do a survey, and then I need to develop a prioritization rubric and evaluate all of our projects. Really think about how you can engage some of those volunteers who are ready to work online and who are going to be really good contact points and communicators for fellow volunteers in doing this work. So it's okay to take some time and strategize and figure out what's possible or feasible or healthy for you to take on with everything else that you have on your plate. I see a note, didn't you adjust the volunteer requirements? Yes, we did introduce flexibility for the 2021 program year, and a couple things I'll mention there. We wanted to provide an opportunity for folks to do continuing education, especially we're focused this year on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're heavily promoting some implicit bias courses that are available through the UC, or some books that have been recommended by our fellow academics in 4-H or in other programs within the University of California Ag and Natural Resources. We're also encouraging volunteers to build their own skills when it comes to technology or facilitation, or support our program online in transitioning to more accessible technology. So we had a great presentation from our statewide marketing and communications coordinator on digital inclusion. I'm learning a lot, I'm making a lot of mistakes, but what does it mean to appropriately caption all photos so that they can be read by a screen reader? That's going to increase the accessibility of our UC Master Gardener and Master Gardener resources. So there are some cool opportunities there that Missy shared, and many, many, many more. I think some of you all had really awesome ideas and suggestions that informed that recommendation that Missy shared with volunteers and coordinators.
All right, and we see that Sharon's state or county did that as well. And we have a few minutes, so if there's any other questions or comments that you all would like to share, feel free. And then we do also just want to, Marisa, I guess we give another reminder that she'll be doing another, a part 2 of this next month, where she'll introduce the rubric that her and some counties developed.
So I think with that, if there aren't any other comments or questions, I want to thank my co-presenter and co-conspirator, Dr. Tamekia Wilkins, for working on this project with me. It's been a big lift, but I think it's been really exciting to have some data that we can point to when we're making recommendations. And we're very, very happy to provide anything and everything to support you if this is something that's of interest to you. If you'd like to take a look, as Tamekia mentioned, at our Qualtrics tool. I'm going to put my email in the chat, but you can also find me online, Marisa Coyne, UC Master Gardener Program, and Tamekia as well.
Yes, thank you both, Tamekia and Marisa. And this presentation was recorded. We'll post it online within the next week. I'll resend out the slides and any other supporting documents that you'd like me to share. And please join us next month on April 21st, when we'll talk about the rubric that Marisa helped develop with her team in California, and how that might apply to you and your ability to prioritize projects in COVID-19. So thanks everyone, great job. I appreciate your time, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good job, Tamekia.
Yes, you too, Marisa.
That flowed super well.
Yes, we're still recording, but yes, it went really well.
We're giving ourselves, leave it in, Nicole. We're giving ourselves a pat on the back. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.
All right.